Hello everybody, and welcome to this video, which is kindly sponsored by Squarespace.
And today we're looking at just adding a little bit extra. So this is the Victualler's Yard, where there's various posters for sale. The latest one is of HMS Victory, but I'm just adding an event, as you can see. So this is the Grand Drac Tabletop Giveaway. I have a lot of wargaming stuff, dystopian wars, airfix kits, a few bits and pieces from various Warlord games, which honestly I'm never going to get around to painting. There's going to be a bunch of 40k stuff as well. So all that kind of tabletop stuff, basically I've negotiated down to one cupboard full of unpainted and unused models, and I'll be throwing in a few other naval related bits and pieces as well. Now they're all going to go up on the Victualler's Yard on January the 20th at 1400 UK time, and they will be free for people to have. The only cost involved will be the cost of postage, because shipping lots and lots of boxes across various oceans could be a little bit expensive, but as long as you're happy to pay postage and you see something you want, you can just have it. And there you go. I'm just uploading a nice image, all nice and easy, very easy to make in the wonderful Squarespace website.
So if after all these little mini tutorials I've been doing, you think you could build a website for maybe ideally naval history purposes, but you never know, you might want to do it for some other reason, then head over to squarespace.com/Drakenfell. You can get a free trial, and once you're ready, that little link will give you 10% off your first website or domain. So thanks once again to Squarespace for sponsoring the video, and on with the main show.
Right, well, fresh off the heels of our chronicling of what historically happened in Operation C, we're now going to look at what might have happened in that ominous what if of what would happen if Somerville actually managed to encounter a portion of Nagumo's forces, using the information we have to hand from the original sources and secondary sources, various primary source archive documents, etc., as to the intentions of both sides, the capabilities of both sides, how many aircraft, how many ships, etc., etc. And what we're going to do is split everything into four main blocks. And the third block is going to be where probably the most variation is going to occur. So the first block, we're going to look at what could happen if the Japanese got lucky essentially the day before. The second block, we're going to look at what happens assuming things go as they did historically, except with a slight alteration to what happens to one of the albacores. And then we see what would most likely happen given Somerville's plan of action if he did encounter Carrier Division 2 at night. Then we have our third block, which, as I said, is the most variation, which is what does Nagumo do when this happens? And then the last block will be what happens the morning after, which will be slightly less complicated than the third block, but it depends on how that scenario happens to go. And as a quick caveat before anyone asks, yes, I have consulted a number of other naval historians on this ahead of time, sounding out ideas and how they think people would react and how scenarios might go. So this isn't just me making things up as I go along. So scenario 1 is the Japanese get lucky, because historically their scouts found Dorsetshire and Cornwall. There is a possibility, of course, that with the slightly different roll of the dice, the scouts find Force A instead. So the force that gets sent after Dorsetshire and Cornwall goes after Force A. Now, historically, the Special Striking Group launched at around about midday, just before, and took about an hour and a half to reach Dorsetshire and Cornwall. It's going to be about the same travel time to reach Force A, give or take a little bit, so we can assume that their attack would begin somewhere between 1:30 and 2 o'clock as it did historically. Now, when the signals came in about Dorsetshire and Cornwall, Nagumo ordered some of the Kates that he had in reserve to be rearmed with torpedoes. However, to fetch the torpedo out of the magazines and switch a previously bomb-armed Kate over to a torpedo, according to Japanese records at the time, is going to take about 2.5 hours or so. And indeed, when Nagumo ordered that switch at 10 o'clock, when the first spotting of Dorsetshire and Cornwall was made historically, they estimated that if they really stepped on it, they might have the Kates ready to go by noon. And as it turned out, that they didn't, where they had them ready a little bit later, they had them ready in the hangars. They then had to get them up on deck and warm them up, which was another whole issue. That in and of itself was somewhat complicated by the return, of course, of the strike on Colombo, which had to be landed and struck down, etc., before we could bring anything back up to the flight decks to launch. So in any case, Special Striking Group goes after Force A. Now, unlike going after Dorsetshire and Cornwall, there are a few things that mitigate actually quite heavily, believe it or not, against the success of this strike group. The Special Striking Group is made up entirely of Val dive bombers. The majority of Zeros are either on combat air patrol, or the majority of them are actually over at Colombo. There weren't any ready to go with the Special Striking Group. So that means you've got unescorted Vals going up against approximately 36 Fleet Air Arm fighters, because, again, as we know historically, the radar of Force A spotted the Special Striker Group heading out and away at about 90-ish miles, give or take, from them. So we can assume a similar level of intercept would happen, and we also know that Cornwall and Dorsetshire intercepted numerous signals, which told them that a strike group was on the way even ahead of that. So there will definitely be a combat air patrol up, and there will be more fighters on their way up or already up there as well, if Force A knows that, hey, there's a strike group coming. The better part of 36 fighters, given that we know that that's what Somerville had up on deck. Okay, the Fulmar is not the greatest fighter on the planet. Now, the Sea Hurricane is all right. The Martlet, of course, being a Wildcat, is reasonably good. But the main thing here is they're going against unescorted Val dive bombers. And as we see later on, actually, in the Indian Ocean raid, when even a tiny handful of Fulmars get in amongst Vals, even when you've got Zeros bouncing them, the Fulmars are able, actually, even though they have very small numbers, to take out a reasonable number of Vals and damage others in fairly quick order. So this Val strike is probably going to run into serious issues of being set upon by various Fleet Air Arm fighters. Probably the Martlets, the Wildcats first, because they're the most capable, highest performance aircraft. And then you're going to have the Hurricanes and Fulmars as attacking them as the Vals close in. This means that not only is the Val attack going to be relatively disorganized, but there's obviously going to be shot down and damaged aircraft that aren't going to make it at all. Then you've got to fight your way through the anti-aircraft screen, which is now 3 capital ships, 2 cruisers and 6 destroyers worth of anti-aircraft fire, not just 2 heavy cruisers. And obviously Warspite's a relatively modern vessel, having been modernized. The 2 armored aircraft carriers are also relatively well modernized. So the number of attacks and their accuracy are going to be much reduced, because remember, again, with Cornwall and Dorsetshire, the pilots could take all the time in the world to line up their attacks and release low. In this scenario, where you've got anti-aircraft fire, you've got fighters, you've got radically maneuvering targets and a lot more anti-aircraft fire, your accuracy is going to be lower anyway, and you're going to have to release those bombs high unless you really, really want to die. And this isn't quite the year of the kamikaze just yet. And then the final thing, of course, is these are 250 kilo, 550 pound bombs. And Japanese records show it's a mixture of semi-armor piercing and high explosive. That's exactly what the flight decks of the 2 armored carriers and the much heavier deck of Warspite are designed to deal with. So, unlike poor old Cornwall and Dorsetshire, which got very heavily knocked about fairly quickly, the number of hits on the British capital ships is going to be much less, and those hits themselves are probably going to do significantly less damage. As I said, the armor flight decks on the 2 carriers will, as we see later on in the war, once kamikazes and various Japanese bombers go after the armored carriers in 1944-45, these decks will reject those bombs. So that's not to say they won't get any hits and there won't be any damage, but the Val strike is very unlikely to do a huge amount of fatal damage to Force A, and it's going to cost the Japanese a fair number of Vals. At which point, Somerville is damaged. He knows now that there's definitely a large number of Japanese carriers out there, because you don't get dozens and dozens of Vals showing up for no reason. So he's going to be hightailing it west. And then the big question comes up, basically, what has Nagumo done with the rest of his Kates? Because if he launches a partial group, i.e. the ones that are ready at around 1:30, 2 o'clock, which is historically when he had given orders for them to be warmed up ready for launch, given that Somerville's been have spent a little bit of time skedaddling west and more time still whilst they're travelling west, skedaddling west, you're talking about having to find and fix Force A probably at a distance of about 200 to 250 miles from the Kido Butai by the time the Kates get there. Now, that is within their strike range, certainly, but whether or not the fighters of the fleet are going to allow Japanese scout aircraft to maintain contact and report back their position is another matter entirely. Bear in mind that shooting down shadowing float planes is something the Fleet Air Arms got very, very good at in the last few years in the Mediterranean at this stage. So, if you've got this kind of catch-22, if Nagumo launches a partial strike, admittedly there will be Zeros escorting, but it's going to be a smaller strike of Kates at a relatively long range, assuming they can find the fleet. There will be some combat air patrols still up. Maybe some of the fighters will have been shot down, some will be damaged, some will be refueling, etc. But there will still be aerial resistance. And as you see with Force Ed, British ships are relatively decent at dodging torpedoes. So there is a possibility, of course, that you might catch a particular ship in a bracket of torpedoes and do it severe damage enough to sink it or stop it. But a partial strike in mid-afternoon is probably not going to accomplish a huge amount, whereas Nagumo could wait until he's got enough to form a really big strike ready to go, which will maybe launch an hour or so later. But now you're assuming that the Japanese have been able to maintain contact with the Force A, despite fighter opposition to their scout aircraft, for the better part of 3.5 hours. The Kates are now probably going to have to be journeying out 250 to 300 miles, so you're starting to push things a little bit. And of course, the more time that Somerville's heading west is, the more time you have for the British fighters to be rearming, refueling, repairing lightly damaged ones, and getting back in the air to provide more aerial opposition. Now, the full strike power of the Kido Butai using torpedo bomber Kates, assuming that they can find Force A, is still probably enough to do damage to, cripple or destroy multiple vessels in Somerville's force. But at the same time, it is relatively unlikely that with fighters constantly knocking off your scout aircraft, that the Japanese would be able to continue maintaining that contact to guide the Kates in. And Somerville's obviously be going to be taking certain amounts of evasive action. And also by that time, certainly Force A will have fallen back on Force B, which means you're adding the somewhat limited, granted, but still available anti-aircraft firepower of Force B, with several more cruisers, bunch more destroyers, and the 4R class to the total defence of the fleet. Of course, the R class are relatively vulnerable to Kate strikes, but so many targets might even distribute what Kate strikes show up. So, whilst there is a potential for the Kido Butai to do very serious damage, potentially annihilating damage to Somerville's forces if they're caught in the afternoon instead of Cornwall and Dorsetshire, it is actually surprisingly difficult, given the precise scenario involved, because they've got to rearm what Kates they have available, and you've got most of the sort of main strike power of the Kido Butai having gone off, attacked Colombo, and has come back and is now in the process of having to be refueled, rearmed, and the pilots rested. If the Kido Butai has its full range of aircraft ready, there, available, and properly armed, and makes contact with Force A and gets good launch off, that's flat out overwhelming force, regardless of how many fighters that Somerville's able to put up, because there'll be dozens of Zeros to counter them. But with this very, very specific circumstance where his ready-go force is purely Vals, and everything else is kind of a little bit patched together, it actually becomes relatively difficult to pull off the kind of thing that you'd see happen to Cornwall and Dorsetshire just because of the different situation. But of course, whatever happens, any damage inflicted is a Japanese victory, because at this point Somerville's running, he has no chance of inflicting any damage on the Japanese, so apart from obviously shooting down a few aircraft. So even if the Japanese don't quite get the results they would otherwise perhaps expect, it's still a net win for them. And bear in mind, of course, that the British in early 1942 do have fighter control and direction down pretty well, whereas even in late 1942, as the Guadalcanal campaign would show, the US Navy really doesn't have a handle on that just yet, which is why I'm allowing a relative degree of effectiveness for the Fleet Air-Armed fighters, apart from the fact the Vals are unescorted, simply because those fighters will almost certainly actually be directed to engage targets rather than completely misdirected. But if the Imperial Japanese Navy's reconnaissance efforts go pretty much the same as they did historically, but when the albacores find Hiryu and Soryu, the one that got its radio damaged either manages to get its radio report off before its radio gets shot up, so maybe Hiryu 0 is 30 seconds slower off the deck, or it gets shot up a bit but the radio doesn't get destroyed. In any case, Somerville has timely information well ahead of time of when the report from Ceylon comes in, and that tells him that, well, there's 2 carriers and 3 small unknown warships, and it tells him where they are. So he doesn't make his course change, because then when the information from Ceylon comes in an hour later and says, oh yeah, well, 3 hours ago they were heading this way, well, he can look at his accurate report from the albacore and go, well, that may have been what they're doing then, but that's not what they were doing an hour ago, so we're going to stick our course. And as we said, everyone's evaluations of courses and speeds agree that if he'd just kept going, he would have run into Carrier Division 2 about 9 o'clock at night. That's a little over 2.5 hours after local sunset, which would have been about 6:15 to 6:30 in the evening at that time period. Now, we know from actions like Matapan what the British playbook would have been for this kind of thing, and we know from Somerville's own writings at the time, his battle reports, what his specific plan of action would have been. So he would have sent forward radar-equipped albacores and swordfish, which is what he did historically, and as we established in the video on Wednesday, if you overlap the search patterns from a position that they would have been if they'd kept going on course, that search pattern neatly overlaps the position of Carrier Division 2. So you found Carrier Division 2 on radar. Well, great, now what? Well, Somerville's plan, as recorded in his reports and as reported by the people who were on the ship, was to get all his torpedo bombers up on deck, equip them all with flares and torpedoes. So this is going to be slightly different from Taranto, where you had dedicated flare-carrying aircraft equipped with bombs and everyone else with torpedoes. In this case, every aircraft is a flare dropper and a torpedo bomber, and you've got a radar-equipped aircraft out there somewhere that's pointing them in the right direction. And bearing in mind that the approximately 9 at night interception involves Carrier Division 2 coming into range of Warspite's guns. Now, of course, the carriers are not going to be immediately behind Warspite a la Matapan. They're going to be just a little bit off. You've also got Force B another 20 or so miles behind. But you've got Emerald, Enterprise, and half a dozen destroyers there as well. So what most likely happens is that the swordfish and albacores take off. They're going to make a very short flight, probably no more than 30 or 40 miles, possibly less. And then one or more aircraft is going to drop flares, because you can spot ships at night, especially if you're guided in by a radar-equipped swordfish going, hey, they're over there. That, of course, is going to ruin the Japanese night vision, and then in come the torpedo bombers. Now, of course, the Japanese ships are not going to be action stations. They're not going to be ready for radical maneuvering, and they're not going to be traveling at full speed either. So very little, if any, anti-aircraft fire is going to go up in those initial moments, apart from anything they've got to get to their action stations. And then, how do you see an aircraft out there when all you've got is the Mark 1 human eyeball and you've got a bunch of flares blazing above you, ruining your night vision? Nonetheless, with that many torpedoes in the water, even if you've only got a squadron of each off of the 2 carriers, so maybe a couple of dozen torpedoes in the water, against an essentially easy target with minimal resistance, Hiryu and Soryu are probably going to take multiple torpedo hits and get crippled. There is a chance maybe one or two Albagores might go after the destroyers, but that's relatively unlikely because the flares will be primarily illuminating the carriers. At this point, Somerville's going to be moving in with his surface forces whilst those torpedo bombers start their recovery, and perhaps the second set of torpedo bombers, if he's only launched one squadron per carrier, are getting up into the air and circling just in case there's further targets to pick off. Because bear in mind, of course, Somerville's intelligence says that the Japanese have 2 carriers, but they also have had repeated sightings of capital ships, so he's going to be a little bit wary, where are these escorts? But nonetheless, move in with his destroyers, cruisers, and warspite. Now, yes, the Japanese destroyers do have long lances, but they face a bit of a quandary. Firstly, it's a night action. They can't realistically actually see out to the maximum effective range of a long lance. They don't know where the British ships are coming from exactly. And of course, you've got the additional problem of the flares that the swordfish were dropping, which again kind of ruins your night vision a bit. The British, on the other hand, have multiple sets of radar, which will be spotting the destroyers as well as the carriers if they haven't spotted the destroyers backlit by the burning carriers anyway. And with the best will in the world, even if Somerville's left a couple of destroyers with his carriers, you've still got 4 destroyers and 2 light cruisers versus 3 destroyers. And if there's N-class in there, they very definitely are superior to the Japanese destroyers that are present in surface action. And to be honest, even the smaller ones are still reasonably good against the Japanese in surface action. They have slightly fewer guns, 4 guns on 4 of the destroyers and 6 guns on the 2 big ones. The Japanese destroyers have 6 guns as a rule, but they're relatively slow firing. And that's before you take Emerald and Enterprise with their 6-inch guns into account. Plus, the Japanese destroyers are going to be somewhat out of position, given that this is a flanking attack, so not all of them are going to be able to position all at once. So, whilst, yes, there are destroyers and there is a risk that one or more British vessels might get hit by long lances in the middle of the night, unlike, fast forward, 6 months to Guadalcanal, the British forces do know how to make use of their radar. They do have a night fighting doctrine that's quite advanced, and they have the element of surprise. And in actuality, even before this theoretical battle, British destroyers had actually snuck past Japanese destroyers using their night tactics to attack Japanese transport ships in the very early stages of the war. But essentially what it comes down to is there's more than enough British light forces to deal with the Japanese destroyers, whilst Warspite lays into Hiryu and Soryu to finish them off, if they need finishing off, with its main guns. This essentially is going to be a wipe for Carrier Division 2. Somerville, as I said, may or may not lose 1 or 2 of his lighter ships to Lucky Long Lances. I wouldn't necessarily put money on it, but it's certainly a possibility. But overall, this is a big net win for Somerville. And this whole action is probably going to be over from the first swordfish strike to the last shells fired by Warspite in well under an hour, which gives Somerville about another 8 hours of darkness. Now the ball shifts over to Nagumo's court, because realistically there isn't much saving Carrier Division 2. However, Nagumo is not that far away. The distance between Carrier Division 2 and the Kido Butai is going to be such that as and when Hiryu and Soryu go up in flames, he is going to see that on the horizon. Now, whilst Nagumo may not necessarily be the world's best carrier admiral, and he is a little bit conservative in his tactics, he is a cruiser and destroyer man. That is basically the meat and potatoes of his career as he's gone up through the ranks. However, he now faces a dilemma, because remember, his intelligence tells him that the British have at least 1 carrier and the three of the R-class present, with a possibility of Warspite and or King George V showing up. Now, of course, those intel reports aren't accurate, as we know, but that's what he's got to hand to play with. So let's look at this from Nagumo's point of view. He has an isolated carrier division, which has suddenly exploded. He may or may not have radio messages saying what's going on, and if he does, then they're probably going to be reporting the initial air attack, which he knows he doesn't really have any counter to. Neither Japanese pilots nor Japanese carriers are really trained at this stage for night flying operations, and they have no radar, airborne or otherwise, which would even begin to point them in the direction of where the British strike aircraft might be. So he has to think about, what could this strike possibly be? What could it entail? Well, if he knows that carrier aircraft are involved, and he knows, well, there's at least one British carrier out there, he's probably going to be able to discern that gunfire is going on as well, so he knows there's at least some ships there. So if he looks at his available intel, most likely, potentially, he thinks this is the 3R class. Now, what does he know about the R class? Well, there's 3 of them. They're battleships. They're armed with 15-inch guns. That could be messy, but they're also slow. His force between, Tone, Chikuma, the Congos, his remaining 3 carriers, and his destroyers is considerably faster. So even if they've isolated and destroyed Carrier Division 2, if he puts on full speed and keeps going, there's very little chance that they're ever going to catch him. In fact, it's mathematically impossible. Also, if this is Warspite and King George V, perhaps they've shown up as per his intel, well, those are faster, and King George V certainly does have the capability of closing down his force if he doesn't get a shift on very quickly. And since this whole thing was pretty unexpected, and in this scenario, they have managed to take out Cornwall and Dorsetshire already, he will be aware that perhaps the British fleet is somewhat fragmented. So if perhaps this is the R class closing down Carrier Division 2, where could Warspite and King George V be? Could they be about to hit him? And of course, carrier strike aircraft can easily close the distance across the horizon to hit his carriers, and he doesn't have much in the way of response to that. So in scenario, if you like, 2A, the second part of the night action, Nagumo might well opt to retreat. He faces too many unknowns and too many potential scenarios he can't necessarily respond to. He has 3 remaining carriers. He needs to safeguard those, because that's, apart from Kaga, now the remaining elements of the Kiributai. There's the US fleet to worry about. So in scenario 2A, he skedaddles as fast as he possibly can to the east. Somerville, of course, would then skedaddle as fast as he possibly can to the west, because he hasn't encountered the Japanese escorts, i.e. the Congos that have been reported. And remember, Intel said there may be a 3rd carrier out there, and if there is, and all the escorts, well, he doesn't really want to run into them the following day. The interesting thing is that then the morning after, there's not a lot either side can do, because if Somerville spends 8 hours going one way, and Nagumo spends 8 hours going the other way, at roughly speaking the maximum speed of advance for each of their fleets, they're going to end up about 450 miles apart come dawn, and Japanese recon doesn't extend that far. And obviously every hour that recon flight, even if it is heading west looking for the British Eastern Fleet, every hour it spends going that way, Somerville's getting even further away. So if Nagumo decides to retreat, then that's the end of it. Carrier Division 2 is wiped out in a surface action mixed with a night air attack. It's a pretty big British victory. But then you have a second possible scenario, which I've called scenario 2B. Nagumo investigates. Now, in this circumstance, Nagumo is probably broadly going to come to a similar conclusion that he needs to protect his carriers, but he also wants to find out what the heck just happened to Carrier Division 2. So what assets could he send? Well, he has half a dozen destroyers, because 3 of them just went up with Carrier Division 2. He has Tone and Chikuma, and he has 4 Congos. Now, if he's thinking, well, potentially there's further strikes coming in towards his carriers, he's going to want to retain at least the capital ships, or most of them, because if, let's say, a King George V comes boiling up out of the darkness, he's going to need at least a couple of Congos to deal with that. And Tone and Chikuma, yes, they are heavy cruisers, yes, they are equipped with torpedoes and 8-inch guns, but they are also his primary recon assets. So sending them off to potentially die in the night is not necessarily a good idea. So at that point, it seems possible that he would maybe send 4 destroyers and 1 or 2 of the Congos out, and retain the other 2 or 3 Congos, plus the Tones, plus a couple of destroyers, to guard his carriers. So you have a Congo or 2 plus 4 destroyers going to investigate what the heck has just happened. Now, of course, according to British night strike doctrine, you would have at least 1, possibly 2 ASV-equipped aircraft circling, looking for incoming reinforcements, plus, of course, the British ships have lit off their own radar, and you have the burning shapes of Carrier Division 2 and potentially its destroyers, which are going to obscure long-range night vision as well. Bearing in mind that, generally speaking, in a controlled night action, you're not going to be close enough for the flickers of the flames to be reflecting off of British ships. Now, a lot of what then happens depends on how Somerville reacts, because if he gets reports that, hey, there's a capital ship or 2 coming in with some smaller warships, looking at his balance of forces, he's still got a number of destroyers, he's almost certainly still got Emerald and Enterprise, and they are almost all probably going to have their torpedoes still aboard. Plus he has Warspite, plus potentially also the ability to call up the second wave of Albacores. So he could decide, well, in for the goose, in for the gander, and try and stand and fight, at which point you'd theoretically have a repeat of swordfish strikes, which may cripple or damage or maybe even sink elements of the Japanese reconnaissance force. And you have radar telling the British where the Japanese are, potentially with flare drops to illuminate them, which also ruins Japanese night vision. A lot of it, I think, at that point is going to depend on how many Congos there are. If there's 1 Congo, well, we know from what happened with Washington versus Kirishima what exactly happens to a Congo class, even with escorts, if it's caught relatively unawares by a radar-equipped battleship with good gunnery. If there's 2 Congos, there's still a reasonable chance because, well, you've got the Swordfish potentially crippling or sinking one of them, and even if they only do damage, you've got Emerald, Enterprise, and the various destroyers launching their own attacks, whilst also getting mixed up in a melee with the Japanese destroyers. Now there's more Japanese destroyers, and they're backed up by the guns of the Congo, so there probably will be losses amongst Somerville's light escort forces. But all of that is kind of a bit of a mask for Warspite dropping the hammer on either the 1 Congo or possibly the remaining Congo. So there is a possibility that Somerville actually adds to his tally at this stage, taking out 1 or 2 Japanese capital ships and a few more destroyers, but there is a pretty much certain chance that some of his own destroyers and maybe Emerald or Enterprise are going to be hit, and a number of those may well be sunk. Of course, this also extends the time of action, because it's going to take the Japanese recon force about half an hour to an hour to get into detection range of what's happened to Carrier Division 2, which means if the engagement then occurs and that lasts for another half hour to an hour, you've cut about an hour and a half off of the retreat time for the British. Although it should also be noted that if one of the orbiting ASV Albacores or Swordfish picks up the incoming Congos, Force B, which, okay, is older, but bear in mind there's still a bunch more destroyers, a bunch more cruisers, and 4 battleships in it. Force B is only about an hour's steaming away from being physically on top of the location. So taking into account gun range, if the Congos are detected with, say, 15-20 minutes warning, then all the British have to do in terms of the airstrikes and the destroyer-cruiser melee is occupy the Japanese for about another 10 to 15 minutes before you get a flanking maneuver by Force B, which isn't going to end well for the Japanese for certain. So that is perhaps the most optimal scenario for the British, but of course this particular scenario could also go somewhat wrong for them, depending on the course that the Congos take, because if, for sake of argument, the orbiting ASV Swordfish or Albacore doesn't see them coming, and they, let's say, take a westerly course to approach from the south, then at that point the British might find themselves attention occupied by Carrier Division 2, silhouetted against the burning remnants of Carrier Division 2, and whilst obviously British radar may pick them up coming in, they're going to be essentially out of position, outflanking the British ships, which is going to cause a much closer and potentially much more devastating melee, especially if the destroyers and cruisers are more in the direction of Carrier Division 2, which potentially leaves Warspite exposed to a torpedo attack from the Japanese destroyers. So this really could go either way. Although perhaps there are one or two more dice rolls that have to go the Japanese way for them to get a win out of this particular sub-scenario than perhaps for the British. The other thing, of course, is that if this fight goes on, as we said, and maybe wraps up around 11:30, and Force B is now there, well, we know Force B really can't make more than about 20 knots, and that means that the following morning, the maximum that Somerville could have gone west at dawn is going to be about 160 miles, limited by Force B. Force A could be further still if you really wanted. At which point, given you've got to add in another 20-30 miles separation to the east for the Japanese main force, and Nagumo's primary force presumably still heading east at some rate, you're probably looking at about 250 miles distance between the two at dawn. Now, obviously taking into account that Nagumo may turn around at some point towards dawn to be ready for air attacks, because he's going to know that the British aren't going to be right on top of him, but also the fact that if you launch and scout aircraft at, say, 6 in the morning, it's got to transit a couple of 100 miles to find something, and which is going to take an hour, which is going to add more distance for some of them. So you're looking at about maybe a 250 to 300 mile gap between them. Now, that is within Japanese strike range and within Japanese recon range for the Kido Butai, even if it is perhaps towards the outer edges of their strike range. So in this scenario, even if everything goes perfectly well for Somerville and he's knocked off a Congo or two and even more destroyers, presumably picking up survivors from some of his damaged or destroyed light vessels as well, he could be subject to a mass Kido Butai airstrike in the morning. However, there are some factors that mitigate against this. The biggest one being that Nagumo has to find where Somerville is first. You could, in theory, just launch the entire Kido Butai air strength west and say, go look for something with scouting aircraft going ahead and hope for the best. But as, yes, Prime Minister might say, that's a very courageous decision, and we know Nagumo is not necessarily the most adventurous of carrier admirals. The other small factor is that the British carriers over the last few years in the Mediterranean have got very good at shooting down shadowing aircraft, at which point scout planes showing up, well, there's plenty of martlets, apart from, the Sea Hurricanes and Fulmars, so if the British keep knocking off Japanese recon aircraft, if they don't get their reports out in time, Nagumo just knows they disappeared somewhere. Even if they get a partial report out, that's not particularly good for guiding in the full might of the remaining Kido Butai carriers. So whilst it's technically possible in this scenario for a morning strike by the Kido Butai to find and do significant damage to Somerville's forces, obviously sinking a reasonable number of ships, I wouldn't necessarily put it in the realm of entirely plausible, simply because of the distance and difficulties in actually pinning Somerville down. And that leads us to option 2C, which I've called Nagumo Retaliates. In this scenario, it would require Nagumo to be a little less conservative than he normally was, but it does play into his strengths as a former destroyer and cruiser man. In this case, we would presuppose that Nagumo would conclude that, yes, Carrier Division 2 is being attacked by British warships. However, he concludes that this is the Eastern Fleet, so he's not worried about other attacks coming in elsewhere. So whilst the carriers are still at risk and the carriers need to skedaddle eastwards, they don't necessarily need to move at absolute full speed. They can continue perhaps at cruising speed with a couple of destroyers hanging around. And then he thinks, okay, well, Japanese Navy, we have good night fighting doctrine. Obviously, he doesn't know necessarily how good the Royal Navy's night fighting doctrine and radar are, but he's pretty confident in his ship's night fighting doctrine, at which point he could send the other 4 destroyers, because he's keeping 2 for the carriers, and maybe the entirety of 3rd Battle Squadron, so all the Congos, And maybe he sends one of the Toneis, because I think he, even if he's being really, really bold, I don't think he's going to send both Toneis. He's going to want some recon and dash heavy gun asset to sit around with his carriers. So let's say we've got 4 destroyers, one of the Toneis, and 4 Congos, and they turn around to go and figure out what the heck has just happened to Carrier Division 2. In this scenario, the Japanese are definitely going to be avenging Carrier Division 2, because as good as Warspite is, she can't fight off 4 Congos at once, and even if you have the second set of squadrons of torpedo-equipped aircraft coming in for an air attack, the anti-aircraft defenses of the Japanese forces are not going to be particularly brilliant, especially with dazzling flares going off, but 2 squadrons of albacores against 4 radically maneuvering capital units, plus destroyers, plus potentially Tone, there's too many targets and not really enough time. So, potentially some hits may be scored, but not likely to manifestly change the balance of forces. You then now have, obviously, Emerald, Enterprise, and the British destroyers, but they are now massively outnumbered and outgunned because the Japanese light forces approximately match up to them, but they're backed up by the Congos, and that's almost certainly not going to end well. Warspite, yes, she can get the drop on and probably savage one of the Congos, but the other 3 will then be out for quite a lot of revenge. And that's being mildly optimistic on the British side. I mean, with that level of force coming in, to be perfectly honest, Somerville's first reaction, if one of the ASV albacore spots it, is just going to be to run as fast as humanly possible, which is the best reaction, but also not one that can actually be sustained because, of course, the Congos are faster than Warspite, so they will gradually overhaul. Now, that does give more opportunity for the carriers to get off torpedo strikes to try and slow them down and disrupt their formation, etc. But it's essentially a case of, can Somerville run faster than the Congos can catch up with whatever Somerville can throw in as a distraction thrown in. And, of course, if we go with what we mentioned previously, with the ASV aircraft miss the incoming Japanese forces, and they do the kind of southern and then come up north loop by going west rather than northwest, then potentially they've also cut off Somerville's line of retreat, and Warspite is first in the firing line. So none of this is ending well for Somerville. The only real, not necessarily glimmer in that particular scenario, but potentially absolute chaos mix, would be that it would take a little bit more time for Nagumo to get all of these forces arranged off of their escorting positions, formed up and headed back Somerville's way, which would mean that if there's a kind of a median where the radar-equipped albacore is able to spot, or radar-equipped swordfish, whichever, is able to spot the Congos coming in with their escorts, if Somerville runs west as fast as humanly possible and Force B comes his way, if Somerville decides to make a fight of it, then you have this utter hellscape of a fight, which is going to be a very, very close-range night action. Yes, the British have radar and a slight numbers advantage. The Japanese have a coherency advantage because they're coming in as one force, not 2 merging into 1. And you now have the entirety of the Congo class, plus at least one of the Toneis, plus 4 destroyers equipped with long lances, up against about 10 destroyers, 4 light cruisers, the entire remaining R-class and Warspite, in probably one of the single most confusing and hellish melees ever seen on this planet in the realm of naval warfare. It's going to put Callahan's night action to shame. Who the heck is going to remain standing after that? I don't want to think. I mean, you could argue that with a numerical advantage in destroyers and cruisers, the British should have the better of the light forces action, and it's going to be at relatively close range, so the short range of British torpedoes won't make much odds. But then the Japanese ships, on average, are carrying more torpedoes, and the long lances hit harder. And, Tone is a heavy cruiser. Emerald and Enterprise, Caledon, Dragon are older light cruisers. Who comes out of that melee? Who's still alive? I don't know. I wouldn't want to predict. You could roll the dice 100 times and get 100 different results, from a wipeout one way to a wipeout the other way, to a roughly even set of losses. But that's assuming that Force B gets involved, and assuming that Somerville doesn't just tell Force B to run and Force A to run and take whatever losses as the Japanese overhaul him. So most likely, the Japanese are coming out on top of this one, but with a very small outside chance of this grand Royal Rumble going on. But of course, there is the other fact that whatever happens in this scenario, it's going to be a fairly extended engagement. Nagumo will be absolutely certain of where the British ships are, because his surface escorts have pinned them, well, not pinned them in place, but pinned down their location, which means that his carriers don't need to go hightailing it all the way off to the east, as they did in the other scenarios, which means that come dawn, they're going to be a lot closer. Somerville's going to have had a lot less opportunity to run west, and potentially with a number of ships sunk or damaged, potentially also slowed down, at which point Shokaku, Zuikaku, and Akagi send out massive waves of torpedo-armed Kates, with plenty of Zeros escorting, at which point anyone who's still left on Somerville's side is probably going to get picked off. Interestingly, the only potential likely survivors from that scenario are probably actually going to be the British carriers, because obviously they don't have a place in a grand Royal Rumble with the Congos, so Somerville will have told them to hightail it west as fast as humanly possible, and they are amongst the fastest ships in the fleet, and if they're now no longer restrained by having to worry about Warspite or the R-class, they can actually get beyond Nagumo's recon and strike range, apart from the fact that Nagumo's first wave is almost certainly going to be going after this mess of destroyers, cruisers, and battleships, whatever's left over from the night action. So the British carriers will probably still be around, but almost certainly nothing else. So that wraps up the scenarios and sub-scenarios that I've discussed with various other people. And as you can see, it runs the full gamut from Somerville pulling off a flawless victory against Carrier Division 2 and then knocking off a Congo or two for good measure, all the way through to Somerville's pretty much entire force getting wiped out, and everything in between, with potentially one of the most glorious night actions ever thrown in for good measure. But in this final section, I'll also talk about one or two slightly miscellaneous things which came up, but perhaps weren't really the main focus of what happens with the night action. So there is the potential, for example, with the first scenario where the Japanese get lucky and find Force A the day before, even if the Vals don't do a tremendous amount of damage to Force A, the fact that they know where Force A is, even if Nagumo's not able to get off a full-strength torpedo strike as a follow-up because of time limits of getting his aircraft sorted and when sunset's coming, etc., etc., the fact is that knowing where they are, he can send out a destroyer or two to try and keep an eye on them overnight. He can make sure that he doesn't go implausibly far east overnight, and essentially just keep a track of them, at least with recon aircraft, and then hit them with a full-strength Kido Butai strike from all 5 carriers the following day, which would almost certainly be a wipeout. So that's a potential as well, but that's one that is a hypothetical that builds off a previous hypothetical. So we're doing the Japanese get lucky one day and then manage to follow up that scenario with another scenario the following day, which is a second order counterfactual, which it starts to get very, very uncertain and very much more wishful thinking. Now, granted, the sort of 2A, 2B, 2C parts of the night action are also technically second order counterfactuals, but they're second order counterfactuals coming off of the first order one, i.e. Somerville doesn't change course, which is a relatively minor change with a basic response built in. The other thing, which I mentioned back in the previous video on Wednesday, was how, potentially the first carrier versus carrier action is a gunfight. Now, where that came in was in talking about scenario 2B, where Nagumo sends a partial force to investigate. Because remember, we said that the carriers are not going to be right with Warspite a la Matapan. They need to be conducting fly tops, and they know Warspite's going in for a close gun action. but Force B is only about 20, 30 miles behind. So they're probably going to be hovering 5-10 miles off, probably off to the port quarter of Warspite. Now, where the surface gun action comes in is that potentially, if a Congo or two is spotted coming in and Somerville starts redeploying his forces to try and deal with that, the carriers have a bit of a problem because the Congos are fast enough, if there's more than one of them out there, and they don't know, obviously, strictly speaking, they know that maybe one or two are coming this way, but maybe there's one or two others elsewhere. So the carriers aren't necessarily going to want to make a sprint back for Force B because there's a chance they could be caught in the middle. But they also don't want to be immediately visible. So what they might end up doing is being ordered to head in such a way that they are sitting such that the Congos, the burning remnants of Carrier Division 2, and the British carriers, Indomitable and Formidable, are forming a line. And the idea of that being that the Congos obviously can't see through the burning remnants of Carrier Division 2, and even if they tried, the light from those burning remnants would ruin the night vision of anyone who's looking that way, which therefore provides plenty of cover for Indomitable and Formidable on the far side off in the darkness. It's not perfect, but it is a way of sheltering whilst Warspite, the Emerald Enterprise, and the Destroyers deal with the situation. But of course, whilst they're potentially also conducting flight ops to try and help out, they do face the scenario of what to do with Hiryu and Soryu, because if the British are interrupted in the middle of trying to deal with Hiryu and Soryu, there's a potential that those ships may, well, they're still going to be afloat, but they may still be trying to get away in some fashion, or trying to, do something like communicate with the Congos, or whatever. Essentially, they're not done for completely. And in that case, especially once the Congos are and their escorts are actually being engaged by Somerville, the carriers may be asked to ensure that Hiryu and Soryu are actually suppressed and dead, but the only way for them to do that, if they're conducting flight ops primarily in support of Warspite and Company, is to engage Hiryu and Soryu with their 4.5-inch secondary batteries. So, whilst it is a niche scenario within a niche scenario, there is a non-zero chance that the first carrier versus carrier action ends with Formidable and Indomitable delivering the coup de grace to Hiryu and Soryu with their deck guns, which would be absolutely hilarious. So there you go, that looks at what might have happened in early April 1942 had the dice rolls gone just a little bit different. But hopefully you can also appreciate that in this kind of scenario where, whilst there is a clear preponderance of force during the daytime on behalf of the Japanese, when it comes to night, the balance is a little bit closer, and when you have forces that are within shouting distance of each other in terms of overall force strength in a given scenario, things really can go all sorts of different ways, which makes positing exactly what might have happened very, very difficult. About the only thing you really can say is that if Somerville had kept his course, Carrier Division 2 probably isn't long for this world. What exactly happens after that, who knows? Anyway, hope you enjoyed it. If you have any other thoughts, further counterfactuals from expanding from the scenarios that we looked at that you might want to promulgate, either really in favour of the Royal Navy, really in favour of the Japanese Navy, or, I don't know, if plenty of people want to see an alternate history painting of that grand royal rumble of Force A and Force B versus Nagumo's entire surface force backlit by the burning hulks of Soryu and Hiryu, well, if anybody's a decent digital artist or wants to work with me on concept art, maybe we can do that. Who knows? Might be fun. Anyway, I think we've gone on for long enough.